Hi everyone, welcome to talk the unavoidable pains of backups. We will present today a deep dive into the net backup solution. And I will wait a bit for, okay, it's fine. So plan of the presentation will be the following. First, we will perform a short introduction. We will talk about the key technical aspect of the solution. We will present how we dug into the net backup solution itself. Then we will present our findings and some takeaways. So first of all, who are we? We are all part of the Airbus Security Lab. The presentation is the work of 5 people from the team. Unfortunately, as what has been said, Jean-Romain could not make it. Thought he was initially supposed to make the talk with me. He catch COVID this week, a few days ago. And you may find that ironic, but we didn't plan for a backup solution. So please be kind to my colleague who answered to a last-minute call to replace him. So the mission of the team, so we are an offensive team. We are performing evaluation on product that Airbus uses or intend to use or sells. And the overall goal of the team is to increase the company security. And so we are performing red team, vulnerability research, and tool development. So what are our motivation behind having a look at the backup software? Well, it's quite simple. On a best perspective, this is really important for resilience. Also, you need some specialized software for backups in a large-scale infrastructure. And this is also often considered as the last line of defense in case of disaster or ransomware attacks. And on a red team point of view, this is also widely deployed into the infrastructure. It has high privileges. It has the potential access to really sensitive data because these are the ones you want to back up. And it has the ability to move large amount of data inside the network. So this is really interesting. And why did we have a look at net backup? Well, net backup is really widely deployed. It's used by 87% of the Fortune Global 500. And it has also a large history of acquisition. It's been sold. It changed its name several times. And you can see that it's a really old solution. And we also had in the past really promising work, interesting work from Emilien Giraud, presented at BRUMP, where he managed to get remote code execution and authentication bypass, and also some presentation disclosure by Google Security on full disclosure, where they also managed to get remote code execution. And now it's our time to present our work. So first, let's get into the solution itself. Now imagine that you're a sysadmin and you want to perform some backups. So you have your workstation and server, and on them you will install a net backup client. And then to manage all those backups, you will use a primary server, which will be used to handle when the backup will be done, how. And for managing where the backup will be stored, you will use a media server. Of course, you can have several media servers, and the media server can be connected to manage hard drive, disk pools, and tape library. And this whole set of components will be called a net backup domain. But as a sysadmin, maybe you want to segregate information, you want to segregate some part of the network with more critical data. So you will install another net backup domain. And let's say that you want to monitor, manage, and check the workflow of your backups. Then you will install an OPS centers to check that everything is going well. So please take in note that we will keep the same colors during the whole presentation. So our client will always be blue, media server always be red, the primary server green, and OPS center yellow. So now I will talk a bit about each component. The client can, as I just presented, be installed on bare metal, but it can also be used to backup cloud infrastructure. It can be used to backup virtual machine, and it can also be installed on some database. This is something that works cross-platform. It can work on a large variety of operating systems. And it has also a lot of different security configuration options. You can enable client-side encryption, secure communication, HTTP tunneling. Regarding the primary server, you can have several primary servers inside the net backup domain. So they can work as a cluster. The primary server can be its own media server as well. It can run as an appliance. And it is managing the policies, which is the set of rules of the backups, meaning when the backups will be performed, how often, on which client, and they will send to which media server and stored where. The catalog is a database that is stored on the primary server. It's actually the metadata of the backups. So it means that this is needed to restore the backups because it tells which backup has been, of which client has been stored where. The primary server is exposing an API. It's also exposing a web UI. It also has many different security configuration options. So this is what the web UI looks like at the top. And at the bottom, you can see a Java web console, which can be used to configure the primary server. Regarding the media server can be connected to disk pools, tape library. It can also run as an appliance. It has option to enable deduplication to optimize the space you use for the backups. And for this, you will again have a database with a catalog of deduplication that you need, obviously, to restore the backups, because this is how you deduplicate and retrieve the real backups. Again, you can enable data encryption on the media server. You can also perform offline storage and write once with many. And lastly, the OPS Center. So the OPS Center, as I just said before, is used to monitor, manage, and reports how the backup are going on. This is how it looks like in the web UI. And as you can see, you can show some nicely graphs. Now I will talk a bit about the trust model. So the OPS Center is at the top of the chain. So the primary server is trusting the OPS Center. The media server and the client are also trusting the primary server. Obviously, because they are connected to it, the tape library and the hard drive are trusting the media server. And the client are also trusting the media server. And all of this trust model will come handy for the rest of the presentation. And now I will leave the floor to Anaïs, who will talk a bit about how we dug into the solution itself.
Thanks, Nicolas. Can you hear me? Yes. Cool. What Norma wanted to say there is that after meeting that backup and know that there is main components that are really different, we have a starting point that is asking ourselves some security questions. These security questions guided our work along our study, but also today for this talk, it will guide our talk in order to embark you in the story. So the first is, what does an attacker need in order to compromise such a software? A quick answer is yes, for sure, knowledge about how it works, the internals, etc. So times to study it, and also develop specific tooling, but that's not definitely not that much complicated. A second question is, from a net backup client, is it possible to compromise a component that is has higher privileges? And the answer is yes. And in this presentation, we will see not all vulnerability in details because some are not technically interesting or require a lot of net backup background, but we will dive into only two because they are useful to build a filter attack scenario at the end. Another question was, actually the net backup clients are machines that you are backing up, and that means that is, for example, the servers of a data center of your enterprise. So for a red teamer, it's really interesting to know if this software could be used as a pivot to attack from a client to another. And the last question is, the main functionality of net backup is to recover the data in case of a disaster. So we were wondering which data could be targeted by an attacker to disable this main functionality. Obviously, there is the backup data itself, but also we will see that there are a lot of metadata that are key in order to restore the backup. And the idea now is to see how. So our approach was the following. We found a team, we read the documentation and understood the main concept that Nicolas previously presented. Then we were provided with the installers of NetBackup, and we were able to set up a lab. At HEXACON Lab, we have a really big chance because we had near to us, we had people that are using this product and that are daily operators. So talking with them allowed to get practical knowledge on how these components are operating together. Yes, we we found new questions after this discussion, and we are able to play with our lab. And because of the complexity of the software, we had to refine again our questions and do this process several times before starting a classical analysis, like binary analysis, for example. So we'll see together the first iteration of this process. So the first wave questions that every deputy asks is what processes, how many, what about the communication between them, what is the attack surface exposed remotely or locally. For that, we have used the most advanced security research tools like PS and listed the binary running on the client first. We have got some. The same for the primary server, and we're going quite a few more. And same for the media and the Open Center. So at this point, the problem was, okay, where to start? We can just pick a random binary and dig into. We have to refine our methodology. And yes, I forgot to mention that all the binary are running our router system, so a real interesting target for attackers in the version that we studied. To limit the binary, we focused on the ones that are listening on TCP ports. There are some. And here's the idea of the ports that are listening. Just an interesting point in the documentation. It says that these ports in gray are legacy ones. That means that the NetBackup workflow does not use this anymore, but still listening. So why not? But we are facing to a wave of binary. The difficulty also is, I think because of the history of this project, there were a lot of different technologies, C, C++, Java, but also very specific ones like CORBA, Sybase. Yeah, we needed to focus on a real case in order to do things that make sense. Here is the observation, the summary of the observation that we did in one use case, a simple case. It's one client that backups his data. So let's say that a backup is scheduled in the primary server. The primary will request a backup to the media. The media then will contact the client. The client will send the data back, and the media server will store his data on media storage. And also, the client have to contact the primary server in order to store some metadata to let the primary know that there is a backup that have been executed. So, as you can see from this observation, you know what binaries are used, and you also observe that PBX exchange is used for all communication between the components, so quite a good target too. And another observation is that client, primary, and media must communicate in order to operate well. But your client is a machine that you are with data, and sometimes, for example, the client is in a team seat. So for that, we also read in the documentation that NetBackup thought about this. So even if the client cannot connect back because, for example, of presence of a firewall, the media server is there to act as a proxy through the PBX exchange in order to let the client talk to the primary. Why not? Well, so here is finally the list of the binary that we choose to target. So you can find maybe the BPCD, which is the agent that is running on the client, but also authentication daemon and other point of interest on the PBX exchange, of course. And from there, we were able actually to perform a basic analysis of each binary, and I let Anka present how.
So now that we identified the component we wanted to work on, again, as we said, it's really important to check the documentation. So we checked the documentation specific to the component we were looking at. We also performed a bit of static analysis. An important part was the process debugging. We used tools such as the perf tools to see an overview of what was going on with help from the kernel. We use some debuggers, obviously, such as GDB. We perform some function hooking using mechanisms such as LD preload. We also needed to really see the interaction between the components. As you saw, it is important. So for this, we use standard tools such as Wireshark, but also the lovely PyNet written by my colleague Benoit. This helped us to perform the TLS decryption and see what was really going on under the hood. We also had to perform some custom toolings, as you will see a bit later, to talk to some component and be able to manipulate the packet and what was being sent. And last, we sometimes follow the logs because they contained a lot of juicy information. Sometimes we changed the debug level of the binaries to get information, and tools such as iNotify was really helpful to see exactly what has changed in between the different tests. So let's take an example. As we told earlier, what was told earlier by Anaïs, the PBX exchange binary is really important. You can see that it's mainly used in the whole workflow of backups. And as said in the documentation, this is a service that provides the single port access to clients outside the firewalls. But as you can see on the workflow, it's also used to allow you to code a binary from the outside. So you can communicate, for an example, with BPRD and other binaries like this. So this is really interesting. And as you can see on each component, and as was shown before, this is also a binary which is running on every component. So this is really an important part of the attack surface. So we started to have a look in this example what is going on between a client and the primary server. So if we have a look in Wireshark, this is what the exchange looks like. At first, you will see that the client is asking specifically for the extension BPRD. So he wants to communicate with the BPRD binary. And then you see that the traffic is encrypted. So obviously you want to have a look at what's going on there. So let's see how binary exposes itself to the outside world using PBX exchange. So in this example, we are taking NBITD, which is the binary used for authentication in NetBackup. So first, the binary connects to the PBX exchange port on localhost. Then PBX exchange answers by sending a random port number. NBITD will connect to this random port number, and upon connection from a client, PBX exchange will now send a Unix path to the NBITD, and the Unix path is a Unix socket, and PBX exchange will use this Unix socket to share the socket descriptor it just opened with the client. And now the NBITD can communicate directly with the client. So now that we know this, we want to write a proxy that will give us all the information. So the first part is quite easy. This is a simple TCP man in the middle. Then you have the connection from the client. And again, it's easy. We can just forward the Unix path. But later it gets a little tricky because we retrieve a socket, which is the socket opened with the client. So here our proxy will create its own client socket and server socket. It will forward the socket, what is read from the client socket to his own client socket, to his own server, that he give using the Unix socket to NBRTD. That way, we manage to perform a real man in the middle and see what's going on. And if we have a look at the different protocol that pass, we can see that one of the protocol is seen by Wireshark as GIOP. This is something that was already shown by Emilien Giraud in his work. This is actually a variant of the CORBA protocol. And CORBA protocol is a remote procedure call kind of protocol. So you have an interface that is defined, and you can call some methods using the right types. So Emilien Giraud in his works had to struggle with C++ binaries where the interface were defined. Fortunately for us, on the OP centers, we can see that most of the OP centers is written in Java, and we can use the jar that are exposed by the OP centers, just importing the jar to call the interface we want. And this is, for example, a small piece of code that we wrote using one of the jar where we are calling the function register explorer on the get discovery services interface. And it will come later only in our findings. So to summarize, how are we doing into the net backup solution? So first, we had to learn a lot about the target to avoid falling too deep. We tried to keep our head of the water by relying on documentation, talking with the architect. And finally, we focused on the critical component that we wanted. So in this case, 8 binaries, and it gave us around 30 CVE. I need to underline that only the top of the iceberg has been studied, and there is probably still a lot to find. And now I will leave some space for Mouad, who will start talking about our findings.
Thank you, Nicolas. So as Nicolas just explained in his part, the internals of net backup, let's dive a little bit into our findings. But before that, just let me show you this disclaimer and let you know that all our work outcome has been shared with Veritas, and their reactiveness was very good, and they reacted positively by publishing, by handling correctly all the vulnerabilities and publishing all the CVEs and the necessary patches. So actually, all the CVEs that we already did show to you has been corrected. A second point that I want to mention here, that all what are going to present here is really our own understanding of net backups. So we are no way net backup experts. And also in our lab, we focus on a specific configuration for net backup and specific options for net backup. So maybe some points or some findings here won't work correctly in other environments. A very colorful panorama of vulnerabilities here. This is a global overview of our discovered vulnerabilities. You have all the color of the rainbow, critical, high, medium, and low, dispatched on different net backup components. At the first column, you have all the services that match a net backup components. So you have all the kind of vulnerabilities that you can find in the world. But for our presentation, we are going to focus on only two main vulnerabilities because for the simple reason that in all these vulnerabilities we have some of them are not very interesting technically to dig into, and some other are very long to explain. So we don't have much time to explain them here, and we are going just to switch on two vulnerabilities. But before that, and as Nicolas explained a few slides before, that is something that we have to zoom in, is the trust chain model in net backup. So as Nicolas explained before, the primary server trusts the OPS center, and the primary server trusts the clients. That's the basic thing in net backup. Adding to that the fact that everything goes, every component in net backup has to go through a TLS communication with other component of net backup. So for how that is work behind the scene is that the primary server is considered as another certificate authority. So he delivers certificates for both clients and the OPS center. This latter, the OPS center needs to access the primary server for monitoring tasks and following the work of the primary server. Having said this, we can conclude from the combination of both that the primary server trusts the OPS center and vice versa. The OPS center trusts also the primary server. And the clients who trust the primary server with their own certificates, which are signed by the primary server, can then connect to some endpoints of the OPS center. So just keep in mind that the clients at the end can directly connect to the OPS center. So this is summed up here by this schema. So having this, if a client can connect to the OPS center, what can we do? It's simply to look for all the Corba endpoints that are present on the OPS center. And the example that is shown here is an example that exploits weaknesses on the OPS center. So a valid client can send a request over the network directly to the OPS center and create an arbitrary account on the OPS center and have an access to the OPS center after that. So, okay, just remember, this is a proof of concept to attack an OPS center, but our goal is a primary server. So how we can exploit this knowledge to go and attack a primary server? So the knowledge of Corba is very interesting, and we exploited it by doing a scan of the primary server, looking for some Corba interfaces that could be reachable behind a PBX Exchange services. And this could be done easily by just looking for the error messages, and you can gather easily if there is a Corba interface and if the Corba interface allows you to have a connection to that interface. So doing this scan can help us a lot to list all the services that are reachable. We won't go through all the services, but we are going to focus only on these three ones that are listed here in the slides, because they present interesting vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities also can be chained to fit in a complete attack scenario that will help after to gain a control access over a net backup infrastructure. So let's talk about these vulnerabilities. So the first one, you see here the CVE ID in the title. This vulnerability is a simple SQL injection that you can spot easily by reading the code, and this is a SQL injection which is in a select statement. Okay, so nothing complex here. But before going further, just let's review the context. So I remind you that we are trying to compromise a primary server. So the context of the SQL injection is that the SQL Anywhere software, which is used by NetBackup, runs as root and system on the under the operating systems, and the database user has access to different hosts, list of hosts, disks, and job, and some credentials. So just using this access, we can go do something interesting in the NetBackup configuration specifically. In front of that, we have also limitations. So the first one is that requests are not stackable. As you can see, the SQL injection is totally blind, so we have no feedback when we trigger the SQL injection. And other many functions that are defined that are not defined in the NetBackup, kind of XP CMD shell that allows to trigger system shell is not defined in the system. And also the database user mentioned here has no access to read and write files. So this is the general context for the exploitation of this SQL vulnerability. I want to underline here just 2 points that you have to keep in mind is that if a machine or host on the network has to access to a net backup infrastructure, he has to satisfy the following prerequisites. Firstly, database entry on the database on the net backup, that primary server database, another file that corresponds to the host that should be present on the file system. Where we can go from here exploiting these vulnerabilities that can be done. We take a step back and analyze all the context, and we saw that combining this vulnerability with other vulnerabilities, we could go further. So what I want to mention here is that the requests are stackable in some newer version of NetBackup, so that you can go further and analyze that. And also we can add an insert statement after a select statement in our SQL injection. We found also another vulnerabilities with the following CVAD, which is a second order SQLE that can be triggered in a specific job in a database. So combining all this information and this one also another vulnerabilities, which is this time a path traversal with the following CVAD, that we discovered. This path traversal vulnerability allowed us to write a file on the primary server file system. This vulnerability regards the following function, and this function receives 2 arguments. And by controlling these 2 arguments, we can go and write a file on a file system. Remember, we need to write a file on a file system to allow a machine to access to the net backup infrastructure. So the path that we can write here is the first one in the list, the remote_OPS host name. So by exploiting this vulnerability, so the trick here under Windows is we used some alternate data stream file system function to write the file, because the first argument is URL encoded, doubly URL encoded. So to bypass this restriction, we went by using an alternate data stream. So this vulnerability allowed us to write a file on the file system. So as you can see here, the modus operandi, we satisfied the first requirements, which are to add in an entry in the database by exploiting a SQL injection, and adding a file on a file system by exploiting a path traversal vulnerability. And by doing that, we bypassed the authentication process. The third step consisted simply to exploit another vulnerability that we found that allowed us to inject code into the net backup infrastructure. And I think there is no better than a demo to understand, to see the efficiency of these vulnerabilities. So you have both the attacker machine, the primary server machine, which is a Windows. Just look here, we have the file system of the primary server. We exploit the first path traversals, and here after a while we have the path traversal exploitation vulnerabilities that drops a file, and after that we exploit the SQL injection, and we can now reach the primary server and execute commands. And the best way to execute commands is the calc.exe. As you can see here, you have your calc.exe that pops up at the end. So a client from the network can execute command on primary server. Thank you.
So thank you for this nice demo, Mouad. As he said, we cannot get into details of every vulnerability we found, but what if we check some scenarios that can be played from them? So from each component, imagine you're an attacker and you can get an access on an OPS center using maybe a low privilege. You get a low privilege shell. We found out that you could get local privilege escalation, but now from the OPS centers, we find also that you could get remote code execution on the primary server using another CVE, and you can also get remote code execution on the media server. From the primary server, which is an important part of the net backup domain because it is already trusted by everyone, we found out that it was possible to get local privilege escalation. We also find out that it was possible to get remote code execution on the media server. And obviously by design, the primary server has read and write on every client. The media server, we found out that it was possible to get remote code execution on the primary server. And regarding the client, we found that it was possible to get local privilege escalation and also to get remote code execution on the primary server. And something that is also more scary is that we found out that it was possible to manage to get read and write on other clients. But this is not the worst, because imagine an attacker now that is outside the net backup domain. Well, we managed to get remote code execution on the OPS center, which is, as I recall, the top of the chain. And we also saw that it was possible to get remote code execution on Windows on primary servers, as Mouad just presented. So now imagine a real world scenario. So you've got your company which is exposing services on a DMZ, and an attacker managed to find a vulnerability on one of them, and he gets a shell inside your DMZ. But fortunately for him, or unfortunately for you, you're performing backup of the DMZ, and the attacker now have access to a net backup client. So from the net backup client, he can get command execution on the primary server, and pivot on it. And from there, he can get command execution on the media server and compromise your precious backup. But also from the primary server, obviously, he can spread and infect all the clients. And that's not all, because from the primary server, it can now pivot into the OPS centers and now compromise your really important domain B. So let's see a small demo. So here we have 4 terminals. One is a client, one is a primary server, one is the OPS centers, and one is the media. And as you can see, they are all on the same domain, domain A. And we have a critical file on each of the components, which is specific to each component. And as you can see, there is no SSH key being deployed on any of them. And so we will start by, as a sysadmin, monitor what's going on, check that your critical file is still there, check that there is no SSH key being added. And now we will, after that, start our attack from the client. So we are starting our ransomware. And first, we are taking control of the primary server. We are dropping our SSH key. Our SSH key is already there. As we can see, there is a 2 key file. But that's not all, because now we will pivot and we will attack the OPS center. It takes a bit longer because we are exporting the cron tab here. And sorry, I'm always having a hard time with white terminals, but apparently this is better for video projection. So yeah, our cron tab has been written already. So in a few seconds, we should have control of the OPS center. That's it. We are now dropping a SSH key on it. We compromise the OPS center. Now we will also compromise the media server to access all the backups. Okay, now we have control of every component, and we can start a ransomware attack. So as you can see, the critical file on the primary server has already been encrypted. We are now encrypted the primary file, the OPS Center's critical file too. That's it. And if we check the content of the file on the primary server, you can see that it's already asking for ransom. Okay, that's it. So as we saw, this is really scary. But keep in mind that everything has been patched, so please patch your software. Now let's go back to our security question. So we were asking what it will take for an attacker to exploit net backup. So as we saw, you need some specific tooling, workflow knowledge. So you should get interest in how the PBX exchange work, what are the backup policy of the world, the trust model, the net backup command, and so on. But we think that this is not out of reach for a motivated attacker. We were asking also, can a primary server be compromised from a net backup client? And the answer is yes, and much more, and as you saw just before. Could the net backup system be used as a pivot to attack other interconnected systems? Well, I think the demo was quite clear. And we also wondered which data should an attacker target to prevent recovery. And for this, let's take a step back. So what do you need to restore a net backup infrastructure? So first of all, obviously you need your backup. So this is quite obvious. So probably you want to have them offline, and but that's not all. You also need the primary server catalog, because this is how you can know which client backup is where. But this is still not enough. You might need the catalog of the deduplication if you have this option enabled, and you also might need the encryption secret if you enable encryption either on your client or on your media server. Finally, this is not mandatory, but you might use a disaster recovery file. This is actually a package which contains everything to rebuild a master server or primary server just as the way it was before. So it's backupping the certificate, the list of clients, and so on. So obviously this is not mandatory, but it can really speed up the process, and in case of disaster, you might want that. Okay, so the data that you need that an attacker needs to target and that you need to ensure you still have are the backup data, the catalog, the encryption secret, and the disaster recovery file. Small talk about the disclosure timeline. So we sent our first report to Veritas about a year ago, and then we sent another report with more vulnerability in April this year. We had a really good collaboration with Veritas. They were really responsive to reports. I'm sure it was we gave them a hard time because we increased a lot their workload. But they were really eager to improve and listen to every recommendation we had to patch. So thanks a lot to them. Now let's talk a bit about the takeaways. So overall, we had around 30 CV. As we said, all the official patch are now available. We demonstrated attacks impact and the complexity. The work presented, as we said, only scratches the surface. There is probably still a lot to be studied. We just focused on critical component, and even on critical component, we may still have missed a lot. So your work is needed. Please have fun, as Renaud said earlier. As we demonstrated, your favorite entreprise backup can be broken, so consider this as a gift to convince your employer that you need to perform offensive or defensive deep dive. By the way, we are recruiting, so you can perform this at Airbus. And that's it. As we said, backups are a pain, but French people eat pain for breakfast, so that's okay.